María Sabina was born on a date she doesn't remember, sometime around 1894 perhaps, in Huautla de Jimenez, an indigenous community of Oaxaca. For geographic context, Huautla is a mountainous region, about a 7-hour drive from Mexico City. Sabina was born to a family of hard workers with little money. She lost her father early in her life and because of this lived with her younger sister Ana Maria and her mother in the home of her maternal grandparents until her first marriage. Sabina describes her first experiences with psychedelic mushrooms as an almost childish sort of adventure with her sister, born out of true hunger. It was no game, though. Sabina was quickly accepted into the higher circles of knowledge and respect that existed in her community's theology, and there began her journey. Sabina became a Phenom, a magical presence and what some describe as a curandera, or a healer. She performed what she self-titled as ceremonies for initially those who were afflicted in her community, and this was what she knew she wanted to die doing. It was innate to her like breathing from her first psychedelic experience. María Sabina wanted to give the power of vision and resilience to those around her that truly needed it. Initially unbeknownst to her, there was a growing outside interest in psychedelics that came from places far, far away from her community and far detached from her ancestors' sacred uses. Suddenly, she found herself being visited by strange white people who wanted to give her gifts like phonographs, objects that she admits having little to no care for. Suddenly, she was being visited by people telling her that they wanted to meet God. While she was presented with signs of respect from these outsiders, even being brought articles that covered her practices by visitors, she was, for all intents and purposes, by modern definition, illiterate. No written agreement or spoken agreement that wasn't in her native tongue of Mazatec could be fully understood. Additionally, Sabina had never truly left her community. While she was brilliant and revolutionary, how is it fair to impose a metric of understanding that she had no reason to abide by onto her? This brings into question consent, but in simple words, these articles mean nothing to her. But she understood that they were signs of respect and hung them on the wall nonetheless. These agreements and explanations of extractionary methodologies could have been entirely misunderstood, but she wanted to help and heal and share her strength, so share she did. In fact, by 1960, Sabina was being visited by rock stars like Bob Dylan. All of this spun on by the Time and Life articles written about former J.P. Morgan & Chase Vice President R. Gordon Wasson after his visit with her in 1955. All of this begs a question, though. Actually, multiple questions. What does consent mean in the context of Sabina's ceremonies and their more modern counterparts? What are the intricacies of adaptation versus preservation? Furthermore, what is an open practice and what is closed? And how are we, as non-native people, supposed to know? Would María Sabina have issues with her continued presence as a sort of figurehead of the modern psychedelic field, or would she have bigger things to worry about? It is important to take a closer look at the specific words of Sabina and practices of Sabina to analyze them for intent and boundaries when answering all of these questions and more. Before we really get into it, though, I think it's important to really listen to the words of Sabina and the chants of Sabina so that we understand kind of what we're talking about in a more holistic way. Before I begin, though, I would like it to be known that this chant that I will be reading is a transcript taken from a recording the night of July 21st or 22nd in 1956. I would like it to be known that R. Gordon Wasson was involved in this recording, and while I will discuss the ethics of this later, I think that that is inherently and innately important to know while I am reading. Nonetheless, I will begin. I am a woman who shouts, says. I am a woman who whistles, says. I am a woman who thunders, says. I am a woman who plays music, says. I am a spirit woman, says. I am a woman who shouts. Ah, our Jesus Christ says. Ah, our Jesus says. Our St. Peter woman says. Our St. Peter woman says. Our apostle woman says. Our shooting star woman says. Our whirling woman of color says. Our woman of the field says. Ah, our Jesus Christ says. Our woman Santo says. Our woman Santo says. To discuss María Sabina's life and work, it is necessary to understand her tools. To separate the psychedelic mushrooms that Sabina ingested and fed to those she was healing would be doing a great disservice to her. Though it may verge on inappropriate given the context of this project, I will take a minute to explain the properties of the psychoactive plants that kick-started the phenomenon that is Sabina. María Sabina was not a mycologist, as we know one, or a person that studies fungi. The fungi that she ingested were deeply ingrained as a religious and immensely sacred function of botany to her since her birth by those around her in her community. In fact, when her family learned of her and her sister ingesting the mushrooms as children in a moment of starvation, Sabina remembers and describes that they were scolded, but not because of an anti-drug stigma, but because the mushrooms were reserved for ceremonial usage, not to be taken lightly. While sacred, these mushrooms were not thought of as drugs or something untouchable. They did not come with the connotations we have now assigned to them, positive or negative. In fact, they existed in a separate category we have no real copy of anymore regarding substances. They never were made a commodity, never withheld from those in need, but they also were not taken without understanding or guidance. The mushrooms themselves are thought to be the species Psilocybe cruescens, or derumbe, meaning landslide mushrooms. They appear as though cartoon mushrooms would, a flat wide cap, gills, and lighter colored stems. When touched, they bruise blue. They are native to the region and function as other psychedelic mushrooms do, meaning that they cause synesthesia-like feelings, or the blending of senses, and vivid thoughts and feelings of self-perception. Typically, the mushrooms are ingested orally, although in Sabina's case, they were specifically always ingested in pairs, fresh, not dried, and the effects could last for hours and hours on end. It is thought that the species was also used by the Mexicas, although this is not proven. They have grown in the mountainous region for eons and continue to be used by spiritual guides, healers in the region, and recreational participants outside of it. There is an endless amount of things to touch on regarding the ceremonies of Sabina, but doing so would take more time and understanding than I have to give. That being said, a few things regarding the practices of Sabina I feel are necessary to know going forward. First and foremost, María Sabina made it clear that she was not doing the work. The mushrooms were working through her more. She viewed herself as a holy vessel for the miracles of these naturally occurring, quote-unquote, little saints, as she called them, and felt throughout her life that she was fulfilling her duty as one of the few alive that had the strength to hold this power and responsibility. Sabina made it clear that one should not make money from the little things, end quote. Nor should they dirty their body with sex or other such indulgences for days both before and after ceremony. María Sabina made it clear to those she performed on that this was not a power to be tinkered with or applied without sacrifice or consideration. To think of this logic being applied to common psychedelic usage now only elicits a wry chuckle from me. There are many accounts where Sabina mentions the principal ones. These can be understood as the spiritual elders of Sabina and her community, that are only accessed by a few. They endow the power to heal like that of Sabina, and are very, very much a closed concept. Her ceremonies were initially performed on those in her area suffering from mental and physical illness, although I want it to be known that this terminology is not used by Sabina or others in her community, and provides only a digestible, westernized view of health. Sabina worked on men and women, elderly and youthful, and those she can converse with in her tongue, as well as those she didn't understand in the slightest. At one point, Sabina healed her sister who was suffering from a debilitating illness. Regarding this, she stated that the saint children guided my hands to press her hips. Softly, I massaged her where it hurt. I spoke and sang. I felt that I sang beautifully. I said what those children obliged me to say. Days later, Ana Maria, Sabina's sister, was feeling better. Sabina explains that after this the people knew of her power and they came to her with their sick for help. María Sabina was known to practice on those haunted by something unseen, those that had lost mobility, as well as herself in recovery from her intensely abusive relationship. She became so respected locally, showered with gifts and requests, that her name began to travel outside of the bounds of Hualta. Maria Sabina sang, she touched, she cried and screamed, she vomited, and also encouraged her sick to vomit as well. The ceremonies of Sabina were far from sterile, and not held in a tile room. They were not measured, they were not confidential, and they were most certainly very, truly real. As previously mentioned, Sabina's practice was very much oral and very much hands-on. She was known to become extremely impassioned when practicing. She would dance and yell and sing while healing. She often dictates that the mushrooms are speaking by following a statement with, quote, says, end quote. This indicates that she is addressing or being addressed directly by the higher powers that be. The words of Sabina are so intensely powerful, guttural, and transcend language and construct even when read in their translated and flat form. They evoke intense emotion, and I would describe them as frequently gritty, religious, genderless, and empowering. There are obvious and repeated themes of transcendence from human form into that of an animal or some other being or spirit. The most powerful aspect of the chants, though, is repetition. There are phrases that Sabina harps on time and time again. It drones and drones until it feels like you know the words yourself, like you were born with them. Even when reading silently, the reader is forced to soak it all in. There is no other option. As word traveled regarding this new psilocybin-inclined mystery of a woman, it eventually reached the ears of a man named R. Gordon Wasson. Wasson was a wealthy, highly regarded man who was, previous to as well as during his obsession with psychoactives, the vice president of a well-known bank, J.P. Morgan & Chase. It was the 1950s, and Wasson wanted to change the world. He made his way to the small mountain community with a photographer and a group of family and friends, and using various tactics of questioning and navigation, was eventually directed to Sabina. Sabina was encouraged by a town official to perform a ceremony with him, a velada specifically. Wasson admitted later in the writing that he deceived Sabina and created a fitting situation to justify the ceremony. This ceremony was photographed and recorded, and spores from the mushrooms were collected and brought back to the U.S. It is not known whether or not Sabina was aware of this or consented to it. Wasson returned multiple times with his wife and others to interview Sabina and practice with her. He also introduced her to mushroom pills that were created in a laboratory and could be more quickly metabolized in the body. Sabina said that the pills felt no different and took them gratefully. Because of the influx of foot traffic in her area, detrimental effects were happening to the landscape around her, and the harvest of her little saints was growing harder and harder each year. Wasson published accounts of the experience and was publicized in the Times and Life magazines by 1957. In multiple cases, Wasson used a name other than Maria Sabina when discussing her ceremonies, and while he said that it was to protect her identity, the impact on Sabina and her town proved this to be yet another fallacy. Other than notoriety, Sabina received no financial or otherwise tangible benefit from this publicity. Quite on the contrary, townsfolk around Sabina actually blamed her for the stir, and at one point her house was burned to the ground in efforts to drive her out. Additionally, she remained unable to feed herself much of the time, and reported that fairly quickly the mushroom stopped communicating with her. Despite this downfall of sorts, by the 1960s, Sabina was swarmed. There are reports of other celebrities visiting her to experience the trip for themselves, although unlike Wasson, they didn't bring photographers, so there is no substantial evidence of this. By the 1970s, mushrooms were a fixture of hippie culture. They were essentially a party drug, although this could be debated. Mushrooms were common fare in music festivals, clubs, and the homes of the elite. While there were many things that contributed to this popularity, Sabina remains central to the narrative. Sabina states that, before Wasson's arrival, the mushrooms were only used to heal the sick, never to find God. While it stands to reason that something is off in this narrative, is it something objective or is it just a feeling? This is entirely dependent on your metric of morality. Sabina was obviously deceived in multiple ways. This has been admitted to and is just the plain facts. Now, will it ever be entirely objective to say that she was stolen from, exploited, and subsequently harassed as a result of non-consensual exploitation of her sacred practices? Maybe not, but nonetheless, I'm far more inclined to question the motives of Wasson and those that followed him, as opposed to the intentions of a miracle worker that was definitionally illiterate. It is my strong belief that this narrative exists in a gray area. To paint Sabina as a sort of helpless receiver of this abuse would be to infantilize a woman with potentially multiple lifetimes worth of knowledge and emotional depth. This is not at all my intention. Similarly, to paint Gordon Wasson as a demon with only malintent and shouldering the entirety of the blame for what happened to Sabina would be to ignore centuries of bloody context that led up to this exchange, and would only serve to take the pressure off of the systems of oppression that put people like Maria in such a precarious and desperate situation to begin with. Maybe there is not one angel and one devil here, but instead an individual manifestation of a history of unfair and poorly translated interactions. Translation theory is a facet of this history that dominates everything from behind the scenes. The barriers presented by language and subsequently the necessity of an interpreter are so vast and glaring that a whole project could be done on just that paradigm. Every interaction between Sabina and a non-Mazatec speaker, specifically from her area, had to be conducted through the words of another person. Without learning Sabina's tongue, what is lost in translation will remain a mystery. The chance that some tone or choice of words or inflection would change this narrative entirely haunts the now popular copies of books like Maria Sabina's Selections that inspired this very project. It is not like Sabina was sent a copy of the manuscript to edit before it was approved. She was sent a copy of the published report as a consolation prize of sorts, and was not even able to read the story that held her as the posed, slightly off-center, beating heart of it all. It's all teetering on a very, very tenuous line. We are not just deciding to trust Sabina or Wasson or whoever your hero is in this story. We are trusting an interpreter and then a transcriber and then a publisher and so on and so forth. With every layer comes a variable of consent and confusion. Maria Sabina remains the root of this project, the core, the heart, but it's become infinitely more complicated than just this one narrative since her time passed on this plane of existence. Psychedelic retreats are all the rage right now. They are attended by mostly wealthy folk, city dwellers and the like that need an escape from their seemingly soulless lives. These retreats can host ayahuasca, mushrooms, and in some cases peyote, although peyote is very expressly a closed practice. Many of these getaways actually occur right around the region where Maria Sabina resided. That mountain area is now a haven for lost white souls. The reasons for these retreats are varied, but they all tie back to one huge gaping hole. That chasm does not have a name, but a lot of people feel it eating at them every day. It's a deep, deep unrest and unhappiness with the situation that's been created over time with industrialization and more recently violent and all-consuming colonization and domination of the environment, as well as the people that worked in harmony with it previous to this murderous push for capital. Now left is an overwhelming urge to find something to fill this absence up with, something that will scratch the itch. We are living in an age where almost everyone is suffering from internal and external maladies, superimposed by systems as well as brain chemistry and broken spirits. Psychedelic therapy offers an alternative, and I want it to be said that this community operates with a different tone than some of these retreats. Psychedelic therapy does not tell patients that will fix their life or help them meet God. It just boasts the ability to maybe help people find ways to pull themselves out of the hole without the crippling side effects of synthetic SSRIs. It is not a perfect solution, and nor should it be. Everyone wants to find themselves, and seemingly not much else. Reddit is chock full of teenage boys discussing their psilocybin-induced ego deaths. Music festivals are full of people timing out their trips to their favorite artist's set for optimal impact. Exclusive, expensive psychedelic conventions are gaining more and more popularity. They fill up venues in New York City with hundreds of people all interested in the same handful of things, but all with potentially very different intentions. These intentions vary from self-advancement internally to self-advancement monetarily, sometimes both simultaneously. There are thousands of stories to be found online in various formats about the magic of a shaman-led retreat and the beauty and grace of the programs. The now obligatory activism aspect of it all being that the price tag may be going to rebuild the indigenous communities. It's a mutual benefit, right? No. It's a continued exploitation and a sore attempt to mask what is really just the boredom of the elite. If you back a whole demographic into a corner of poverty and then hand them a few $100s in return for some escape from your fast-paced stock trading lifestyle in a gray concrete jail you walked yourself into, who's really benefiting at all? Wasson may not have been the only true devil at the end of the day, but I will say that he functioned as some sort of blueprint. This was a man that had everything our society tells us we need to be happy: money, property, love, children, notoriety, and respect. And yet he was not satisfied. This lacking was what changed Sabina's story. The search from Wasson created the story I just told bits and pieces of. To this day, we are surrounded by wealthy people in the same boat who are experiencing the same things as Wasson. I'm talking about bankers, politicians, mega company owners, and the like. They continue to contribute greatly and disproportionately to the destruction of our ecosystem with their companies, and then when they feel bored or dissatisfied, they continue to plunder, but in a different way. I want to repeat again that this function feels different to me than that of psychedelic therapy, which is presenting itself as a low-budget therapy alternative for those who exist in a different reality than people like Wasson, for those who are also in a hole, but a much more superimposed as well as self-imposed hole, for those that don't have health care, for those that Sabina would have accepted. It was never the practice of accepting outsiders that irked Sabina. It was the manner in which her medicine was shared with the general public, and the disrespect and dishonesty with which many of the outsiders who visited her conducted themselves with. Here is my real point. We all want to feel better. Knowledge regarding healing practices have been around long before Sabina, and they did not die with her. It is obvious that some non-native people are starting to become open to try anything to heal themselves and those they love. But if we try anything with disregard for context and impact on the people that hold this knowledge, we will eventually find ourselves in an even worse situation, just with new tools. Additionally, until the base of consent and respect is tangibly rebuilt in the realm of psilocybin mushrooms and other naturally occurring drugs like them, the quote-unquote movement will never truly be revolutionary, and will simply function as a more open-minded, greenwash product and supporter of systematic, continued colonization. A good first step would be a popular rewriting of the narrative of María Sabina that plagues the community with blurred lines of consent and establishes a base of distrust. Hello, face behind the voice. I want to take a minute to conclude, and I want to dedicate this essay, this spoken essay, to María Sabina entirely. While it still speaks to a higher purpose, I almost inevitably it became about María Sabina, and I completely stand by that. It was my attempt to bring light to a side of her story that I feel is not told enough. That being said, though, there is still so much more to say and defend, but it would have been an hour-long video essay, which feels like a lot. Additionally, I wanted to quickly explain my reasoning for the format and style. I did not want this essay to rely heavily on visuals or photographs or diagrams. I know that has created somewhat of an inaccessible product in its own right, seeing as it's 25 minutes long with little to no visual aid, and it's sometimes really hard to follow, and I understand that. I also did not want my face to be in frame for more than this conclusion. Despite these difficulties and limitations, I deeply feel that this was the only way to really honor Sabina in this context, especially since I already have some internal doubts about her being the center of an academic project to begin with. Additionally, while I also have doubts about the ethics of the book that this project was born out of, María Sabina's selections, without access to it, without the discovery of it, I would be a completely different person. This project would not exist, and I would not have asked any questions. So there has to be some kind of beauty there, I feel. Additionally, to conclude, I want to say that María Sabina may just be one woman, but she functions as a symbol of Indigenous survivance and resilience, and it is my belief that this counter-narrative, given the chance, could make substantial waves in realms even outside of alternative medicine. That is all I got. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.